The summer of 1965 in Selma, Alabama, felt different from any other. The air was thick with more than just the usual southern heat. It carried the weight of change, hope, and unrest. From her wooden porch swing, a young high school student watched the world changing before her eyes. She'd lived in this house her whole life, right on Jefferson Street, where the paint peeled off the old buildings and everyone knew each other's stories. Every morning, she'd watch her neighbors heading to work, exchanging quiet nods and knowing glances. The adults spoke in hushed tones about voting rights and protests, while the young folks grew bolder with their dreams of equality. Her mother worked as a seamstress in one of the white-owned shops downtown, coming home with stories that made her blood boil: separate entrances, no access to the main fitting rooms, and wages that were just barely enough to get by. The local diner, where her father sometimes stopped for coffee, still had those signs she'd grown to hate. Whites only, they declared in bold letters, as if some people's money wasn't good enough to buy a simple cup of coffee. She remembered how her little brother, just 6 years old, had asked why they couldn't sit at the nice tables by the window. The question had hung in the air, heavy with the weight of centuries of injustice. But things were starting to shift. The civil rights meetings at Thompson's Grocery's back room were getting bigger every week. What started as a handful of determined souls had grown into a movement that couldn't be ignored. People were tired. Tired of being told they couldn't vote because they failed impossible literacy tests. Tired of stepping off sidewalks when white folks passed by. Tired of explaining to their children why the world treated them differently. She'd started attending these meetings secretly at first, slipping out after dinner under the pretense of studying at a friend's house. The energy in that room was electric. People from all walks of life gathered there: teachers, factory workers, farmers, and students like herself. They shared stories, planned peaceful protests, and learned about their rights. An older gentleman who'd been organizing for years taught them about nonviolent resistance, about standing tall in the face of hatred without letting that hatred poison their own hearts. The television in their living room brought news from other parts of the South: Montgomery, Birmingham, Nashville. Each city had its own battle stories, its own heroes and martyrs. She'd watch the news with her family, their faces illuminated by the flickering black and white screen as they witnessed history unfolding. Dr. King's words echoed through their small living room, speaking of dreams that seemed both impossible and inevitable. When word spread that organizers were planning a march to Montgomery, the whole community buzzed with anticipation. 54 miles to the state capital, a journey that would normally take just an hour by car, would become a powerful statement about the long road to justice. The march would demand what should have been theirs all along: the simple right to vote, to have a say in the laws that governed their lives. Her parents were worried, of course. They'd seen what happened to protesters in other cities: the fire hoses, the police dogs, the billy clubs. Things are changing, they'd say, but change doesn't have to come at the cost of your safety. But she couldn't ignore the fire in her heart, the voice that told her this was her moment to stand up and be counted. In the days leading up to the march, she helped make sandwiches and collect water bottles. The women of the neighborhood gathered to sew banners and signs, their fingers working quickly as they shared stories and songs. The men discussed routes and safety plans, marking safe houses along the way where marchers could rest and find refuge if needed. The young folks, her friends and classmates, practiced what to do if confronted by angry mobs or police. They role-played scenarios, learning to protect their vital organs if struck, how to help each other if tear gas was used. It was terrifying and empowering all at once, the knowledge that they were preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. As the sun set on the eve of the march, she sat on that same porch swing, listening to the crickets chirping their eternal song. The street was quiet now, but tomorrow it would fill with the footsteps of hundreds marching toward hope. Her heart raced with fear and excitement as she imagined what lay ahead. Whatever happened tomorrow, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. Not for her, not for Selma, and not for America. Dawn broke over Selma with a stillness that felt almost unnatural. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the sweet scent of early spring magnolias. Outside Brown Chapel AME Church, people began gathering before the sun had fully risen, their breath visible in the morning chill. Some walked for miles to be there, carrying small bags with water bottles and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. The church stood like a guardian, its brick walls having witnessed countless prayers for freedom. Today, those prayers would take the form of footsteps. Inside, the wooden pews were already filled with people of all ages. Grandmothers in their Sunday best sat next to college students in denim. Young mothers cradled sleeping babies, while fathers held their children's hands tight, knowing this day would live in their memories forever. The morning service was different from usual. Instead of regular hymns, the congregation sang freedom songs that made the walls vibrate with hope and determination. "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around" echoed through the chapel, each verse growing stronger than the last. Even those who'd never sung before found their voices joining the chorus, creating a sound that seemed to reach beyond the church's walls and into the hearts of everyone present. As the morning progressed, more people arrived. Northern college students who'd traveled hundreds of miles stood shoulder to shoulder with local factory workers. White clergy members from across the country mingled with black community leaders, all united in their belief that change was not just possible but necessary. Someone handed out small cards with instructions for nonviolent protest, what to do if confronted, how to protect yourself and others, when to link arms, and how to remain peaceful even in the face of violence. The organizers moved through the crowd, their voices calm but firm as they gave final instructions. "Remember, we're marching for our right to vote," one leader explained, his voice carrying to the back of the church. "We're marching for our children and their children. We're marching for America itself." The words settled over the crowd like a blessing, reminding everyone why they were willing to risk so much. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky as people lined up in rows of two. There was an art to this organization. Older folks and those who couldn't walk far were sent back to support roles. The strongest were placed on the edges of the group, where they might face the greatest danger. Younger participants were instructed to stay in the middle, protected by the crowd around them. Someone started humming "We Shall Overcome," and soon the entire crowd joined in. The sound swelled and ebbed like waves on a shore, carrying with it the hopes and fears of generations. A young boy, no more than 12, stood tall beside his father, trying to match the serious expression on the adults' faces. Nearby, an elderly woman clutched a small American flag, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she looked at the gathered crowd. The leaders took their positions at the front of the line. They wore their Sunday suits, pressed and proper, making a statement with their very appearance that they deserved the same respect as any other American citizen. Behind them, the crowd stretched for blocks, over 600 people ready to walk toward history. Each person carried something, a small bag, a banner, or simply their courage. Final checks were made. Water stations were confirmed along the route. Volunteer medics with their small first aid kits took their positions throughout the crowd. Someone passed out hard candies, small comforts for what everyone knew would be a long and potentially dangerous journey. The atmosphere was a mix of church picnic and military operation, with both joy and gravity in equal measure. As the signal to begin came, a hush fell over the crowd. The first step was taken, then another and another. The sound of hundreds of feet moving in unison filled the street. From porches and windows, people watched and waved, some crying, others praying, all knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The march route would take them through downtown Selma, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and then on toward Montgomery. 54 miles lay ahead, but this first day, this first step, held all the weight of history. Children ran alongside the marchers for short stretches, while elderly folks who couldn't make the journey stood on sidewalks, bearing witness with their presence. As they approached downtown, the marchers' songs grew stronger. Their footsteps found a rhythm, a heartbeat of purpose that seemed to echo through the streets of Selma. Store owners watched from behind glass windows, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed anger. But the marchers kept their eyes forward, their heads held high, dignity wrapped around them like armor. None of them could know exactly what lay ahead at the bridge. None could foresee how this day would be remembered in history books. But in that moment, as the morning sun warmed their faces and their voices rose in harmony, they knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. They were the conscience of a nation, walking together toward a future they could only imagine. The Edmund Pettus Bridge rose before them like a mountain, its steel arches reaching into the clear Alabama sky. As the marchers approached, their footsteps echoing against the pavement, none could have predicted how the next few minutes would change American history forever. The bridge, normally just a way to cross the Alabama River, was about to become a symbol of both struggle and hope. The front line of marchers paused briefly at the foot of the bridge, adjusting their suit jackets and straightening their ties. They had dressed their best for this moment, wearing their Sunday clothes to show the world their dignity. Behind them, the crowd of peaceful protesters stretched back several blocks, their freedom songs floating on the breeze. Children clutched their parents' hands, while elderly folks leaned on canes but stood tall with pride. As they began the climb up the bridge's slope, everyone could feel their hearts beating faster. Whether from the physical effort of the climb or from nervous anticipation, no one could say. The songs grew quieter, replaced by the sound of hundreds of feet moving in unison on the steel structure. From this height, they could see the other side of the bridge, where something seemed wrong. At first, it looked like a mirage in the distance, the glint of sun on metal, the strange shapes of vehicles blocking the highway. But as they reached the crest of the bridge, the scene became terrifyingly clear. A wall of state troopers stood waiting, their badges catching the sunlight. Behind them, mounted police sat atop nervous horses. The sight of gas masks and billy clubs sent a chill through the crowd despite the warm afternoon sun. Time seemed to slow down. The front line of marchers stopped, creating a ripple effect as those behind them gradually came to a halt. The singing faded completely now, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the river flowing beneath the bridge. A breeze carried the scent of the water up to them, mixing with the growing tension in the air. Through a bullhorn, an order to disperse crackled across the space between the two groups. The words bounced off the bridge's steel beams, harsh and threatening. The marchers stood their ground, their training in nonviolent resistance fresh in their minds. They had been prepared for this, or so they thought. What happened next seemed to unfold in both slow motion and terrifying speed. The line of troopers began advancing. The mounted police spurred their horses forward. Someone in the crowd started singing, "We Shall Overcome," but the melody was quickly drowned out by the sound of boots on pavement and horses' hooves on steel. The first wave of tear gas caught everyone by surprise. White clouds billowed across the bridge, carried by the same breeze that had earlier brought the river's scent. People began coughing, their eyes burning. Those who had handkerchiefs pressed them to their faces. Others used their sleeves, trying to filter the air. The chaos had begun. Through the gas and confusion, people tried to help each other. Young folks supported elderly marchers, helping them turn back. Parents shielded their children with their own bodies. The training in nonviolent resistance was put to the ultimate test as clubs swung and horses pushed through the crowd. Not a single marcher raised a hand in violence, even as they were struck down. The retreat back down the bridge became a desperate scramble. People who had marched up with dignity and hope now ran through clouds of tear gas, trying to help others while gasping for breath. The sound of screams mixed with the thunder of horses' hooves on the steel bridge. News cameras captured it all: the chaos, the courage, the cruelty. Back at Brown Chapel, those who had stayed behind rushed to help the returning marchers. They threw open the church doors, transforming the sanctuary into an emergency aid station. Women who had prepared food for the march now tear pieces of their own dresses to use as bandages. Men who had been too old to march carried injured protesters into the church. Young people ran for water and medical supplies. The air inside the church was thick with the lingering effects of tear gas that clung to people's clothes, mixing with the sharp smell of antiseptic. Doctors and nurses who had volunteered to support the march now worked frantically to treat the injured. Through it all, prayers and hymns could be heard, offering comfort to those who were hurt and strength to those who were afraid. As evening fell, news of what had happened on the bridge spread across the nation. Reporters who had witnessed the violence filed their stories. Television stations interrupted their regular programming to show footage of peaceful protesters being attacked. In living rooms across America, people watched in horror as the events of Bloody Sunday unfolded on their screens. The day that had started with such hope had turned into something none of them could have imagined. But even in the midst of pain and disappointment, a new kind of determination was being born. What happened on the Edmund Pettus Bridge would not be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of a new chapter in the fight for civil rights, one that would eventually lead to victory. The morning after Bloody Sunday dawned quiet and heavy. Brown Chapel AME Church, which had always been the heart of the community, now served as both hospital and sanctuary. The wooden pews had been pushed to the walls to make room for cots and makeshift medical stations. The usual smell of wood polish and old hymnals was replaced by the sharp scent of antiseptic and lingering tear gas. Volunteers moved quietly through the space, their footsteps echoing off the high ceiling. Local doctors and nurses who had worked through the night still tended to the injured, their faces showing exhaustion but determination. Someone had set up a coffee station in the church kitchen, and the aroma drifted through the building, providing a small comfort in the midst of pain. The injured lay on cots and blankets, their wounds telling the story of yesterday's violence. An elderly deacon, who had marched despite his arthritis, had bandages wrapped around his head, but still hummed gospel songs to comfort those around him. A young mother cradled her arm in a sling while her children played quietly at her feet, too young to understand the full meaning of what they had witnessed. Outside the church, people from the community streamed in with whatever they could offer. Women arrived carrying covered dishes, cornbread, fried chicken, and sweet potato pie, knowing that healing bodies needed nourishment. Men brought extra chairs and blankets from their homes. Children helped by running errands, carrying messages between families, and fetching water for the injured. The television in the church basement stayed on all day, broadcasting images from the bridge that made everyone who watched them catch their breath. For the first time, the whole nation could see what had happened. The black and white footage showed peaceful marchers being attacked, the tear gas clouds, the chaos. People gathered around the small screen, some seeing themselves or their loved ones in the grainy images, others weeping at the sight of such brutality. But something unexpected was happening too. The phone in the church office rang constantly. Calls came in from across the country. Clergy members, college students, housewives, and businessmen, all asking how they could help. Some were already on their way to Selma, bringing medical supplies and offering their support. The attack on the bridge had awakened the nation's conscience. In homes throughout Selma, families gathered to talk about what had happened and what would come next. Parents tried to explain to their children why the march was necessary, why they had to stand up for their rights even when it was dangerous. Around kitchen tables, over cups of coffee that grew cold while people talked, the community began to plan their next steps. The injured weren't just healing their physical wounds. They shared their stories with each other, each tale becoming part of a larger narrative. A teenage boy described how a stranger had pulled him away from the gas. A grandmother told how she had stood her ground even as horses charged toward her. These stories became a kind of medicine themselves, helping people understand they weren't alone in their fear or their courage. News reporters arrived from everywhere: New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. They set up their cameras on the church steps and interviewed anyone willing to speak. Many of the marchers, despite their injuries, spoke with dignity about their commitment to nonviolence and their determination to try again. Their words would be heard in living rooms across America, changing hearts and minds with their quiet strength. By late afternoon, word spread that Dr. King was coming. The news traveled through the community like electricity, giving people new energy despite their exhaustion. Meeting rooms in the church basement filled with local leaders and organizers, making plans for another march. This time, they said, the whole world would be watching. The day brought telegram after telegram from supporters. Each message was read aloud in the church, met with soft amens and nodded heads. A group of nuns from Michigan was driving down with medical supplies. A rabbi from New York was bringing a busload of supporters. Labor unions were sending funds to help with expenses. The violence on the bridge had awakened something in the American people. As evening approached, people gathered for a prayer service. The church was fuller than it had ever been, with every inch of space occupied. Those who couldn't fit inside stood in the doorways and outside the windows. When they sang "We Shall Overcome," the sound seemed strong enough to shake the very foundations of segregation. The day that began in pain was ending in purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in this sacred space, the community drew strength from each other. The brutal events on the bridge hadn't broken their spirit. Instead, they had revealed their strength. As darkness fell over Selma, plans were already being made for the next march. This time, they knew would be different. This time, all of America was watching. The days following Bloody Sunday transformed Selma from a small southern town into the heart of a national movement. Every bus arriving at the station brought new faces, ministers in their clerical collars, college students with backpacks full of supplies, and ordinary citizens who couldn't stay home after seeing what had happened on their television screens. The local high school gym became an impromptu welcome center. Tables were set up with sign-up sheets and maps of the town. Local families opened their homes to strangers, sharing whatever space they had. The smell of coffee and fresh cornbread filled kitchens as hosts and guests shared meals together, swapping stories and finding common ground despite their different backgrounds. A young minister from Boston sat at a kitchen table with a local factory worker, both drinking sweet tea while discussing what brought them here. "When I saw those images on TV," the minister said, his voice soft with emotion, "I told my congregation I had to come. This isn't just your fight anymore, it's all of ours." The factory worker nodded, understanding that something had shifted in America's conscience. The planning meetings grew larger each day, spilling out of Brown Chapel's basement into nearby community centers and church halls. People who had never spoken in public before found their voices, sharing ideas about route safety and organizing food stations. Northern College students learned freedom songs from elderly church members, their voices joining together in harmony that bridged generations and geography. Every morning brought new headlines. Newspapers from across the country carried stories about Selma. Reporters camped out on church steps, their cameras ready to capture history in the making. Local children ran errands for the news crews, proud to be part of something so important. Even those who had opposed the movement couldn't ignore the spotlight now shining on their town. In Washington, D.C., politicians faced mounting pressure to respond. Phone lines to congressional offices rang constantly as Americans demanded action. The footage from the bridge had done what thousands of words couldn't. It had made the struggle for voting rights impossible to ignore. President Johnson's staff worked late into the night, drafting what would eventually become the Voting Rights Act. Back in Selma, preparations for the Second March took on new urgency. This time, organizers mapped out every detail. Volunteers with medical training wore white armbands, ready to help if needed. Others learned to use simple cameras, determined to document whatever might happen. The newcomers trained alongside local residents in nonviolent resistance, practicing how to protect themselves without fighting back. The town's atmosphere had changed. Some white business owners who had always stayed neutral now quietly offered support. A back door left unlocked for meetings, a box of supplies appearing mysteriously, a warning passed along about troublemakers' plans. Not everyone had a change of heart, but enough did to show that change was possible. In the evenings, freedom songs filled the air as people gathered on porches and in church basements. A group of students from Michigan learned to sing "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around" from an elderly grandmother who had been singing it since her own childhood. The old spiritual took on new meaning as voices from north and south, young and old, black and white, joined together. Local teenagers found themselves giving directions to famous musicians and actors who had come to show support. Even those who couldn't stay sent telegrams and donations. Money arrived for bail funds and medical supplies. Boxes of food and clothing appeared from churches and synagogues across the country. Each delivery reminded the community that they weren't alone anymore. The air crackled with anticipation as news spread that Dr. King would lead the next march himself. People spoke in excited whispers about the federal court order being sought to protect the marchers. This time would be different. This time they had the nation's eyes upon them, and the nation's conscience had been awakened. In quiet moments between the planning and the singing, people shared their hopes for what might come after. An elderly man spoke of finally being able to vote after decades of being turned away from the polls. A young woman imagined her future children growing up in a different world. These personal dreams became part of the larger vision they were all marching toward. As the sun set each evening, the strategy meetings would end, but small groups lingered, talking and praying together. The shared meals, the late-night conversations, the songs and stories, all of it was weaving a new kind of community. What had started as a local protest for voting rights had become something larger, a movement that was changing not just laws, but hearts and minds across America. 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday, the morning dawned with a different kind of energy. This time, when people gathered at Brown Chapel, they saw something that lifted their spirits. Federal marshals in official uniforms, there to protect them. The court had granted an order allowing the march, and President Johnson had sent protection, the dream of reaching Montgomery was finally within reach. The crowd was much larger now, nearly 3,000 strong. Religious leaders of every faith stood together. Protestant ministers in their collars, Catholic priests in their cassocks, rabbis wearing yarmulkes, and nuns in their habits. They talked quietly with local residents who had been there on Bloody Sunday, sharing prayers and hopes for the journey ahead. The preparations showed how much had changed. Water stations were set up along the route. Church kitchens had been cooking for days, preparing food for the marchers. Volunteers wore color-coded armbands showing their roles: medical help, water carriers, message runners. Cars would drive alongside with supplies, and designated rest areas were marked on everyone's maps. As they lined up to begin, an elderly man who had worked the fields all his life stood next to a young college professor from New York. A teenager who had been injured on Bloody Sunday now walked with the help of a crutch and the steady arm of a minister from Chicago. The crowd was like America itself, all ages, races, and backgrounds united in purpose. The first steps toward Montgomery felt different from before. The songs were stronger, voices raised with newfound confidence. "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around" echoed off the buildings as they moved through Selma. This time, when they approached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, hearts beat faster with memory but not fear. Crossing the bridge became a moment of triumph. Many people wept as they walked across, remembering the violence of 2 weeks ago. But these were not tears of fear. They were tears of determination, of overcoming. Some touched the steel railings as they passed, transforming a place of pain into a symbol of victory. The highway to Montgomery stretched out before them, 54 miles of Alabama road. The march would take 5 days, with people walking as far as they could before resting at designated camps. Those who couldn't walk the whole way helped at the camps, cooking meals and tending to tired feet. Each night, the camps came alive with song and prayer, stories and shared hopes. During the day, the march moved like a river of humanity flowing toward justice. People took turns carrying the American flag, each person holding it high for a stretch before passing it to another. Children ran alongside for short distances, gathering wildflowers from the roadside. Farmers stopped their work to watch, some removing their hats in respect, others joining the march right from their fields. The weather changed as they walked: sunshine and rain, warm afternoons and chilly mornings. But nothing stopped the march's progress. When it rained, people shared umbrellas and raincoats. In the heat, they passed water bottles down the line. Every few miles, local supporters appeared with fresh coffee or homemade sandwiches, supporting the marchers in whatever way they could. News cameras followed their progress, broadcasting nightly updates to the nation. Reporters walked alongside, collecting stories. A young man told how his grandfather had tried to register to vote 7 times over 40 years. A teacher spoke about wanting her students to grow up in a world where they would never be turned away from a voting booth. Each story added to the march's purpose. As they got closer to Montgomery, more people joined. The crowd grew to 25,000 strong. Those who had walked all the way from Selma helped guide the newcomers, showing them how to pace themselves, when to rest, how to support each other. The line of marchers stretched for miles, their footsteps drumming a rhythm of change into the Alabama soil. On the final day, as the state capitol came into view, a hush fell over the crowd. The dome rose above the trees, gleaming in the sunlight. Many had only seen it in pictures before, but now they were here, carrying their hopes and dreams right to its steps. The silence soon gave way to song, "We Shall Overcome," rising from thousands of throats, stronger than ever before. Standing before the Capitol, they were no longer just marchers. They were witnesses to history, participants in change. Dr. King's voice rang out across the crowd, speaking of justice and hope, of dreams and determination. The words floated over the gathered thousands, touching hearts and minds, promising that change was not just possible, but inevitable. Their feet were tired, but their spirits soared. They had done what many thought impossible. They had walked from Selma to Montgomery, and with every step, they had moved America closer to its promises of freedom and justice for all. The summer heat had returned to Selma by the time President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in August 1965. People gathered around television sets in living rooms and shops to watch the ceremony. In one local barbershop, the usual buzz of clippers fell silent as everyone listened to the president's words. an elderly man who had first tried to vote in the 1920s wiped tears from his eyes as he watched history being made. The changes came quickly after that. The voter registration office, once a place of frustration and rejection, now had a line stretching around the block most days. Local people who had marched to Montgomery helped their neighbors fill out the forms. A retired school teacher who had taught 3 generations of students sat at a small table outside, patiently explaining the process to anyone who asked. That fall, many people in Selma voted for the first time in their lives. A grandmother brought her grandchildren with her to the polling place, wanting them to witness the moment. "I want you to remember this," she told them, her voice trembling with emotion. "People fought and bled for this right. Some died for it. Don't you ever take it for granted." The children nodded solemnly, understanding they were part of something important. The impact rippled out beyond voting. Young people who had been part of the movement went off to college with new purpose. Some became lawyers, determined to continue the fight for justice in the courts. Others became teachers, making sure future generations would know the story of what happened in Selma. A few even ran for local office, turning their protest into direct political action. The town itself had changed. Places that had once been segregated now opened their doors to everyone. The whites-only signs came down, though some paint outlines stubbornly remained as fading reminders of the past. Former opponents of the movement quietly changed their ways, some even admitting they had been wrong. Not everyone's heart had changed, but the law had, and that was a start. Visitors still came to Selma, but now they were tourists and historians rather than protesters. They wanted to walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to stand where history had happened. Local people became storytellers, sharing their experiences with these pilgrims of memory. Each story helped ensure that what happened would never be forgotten. In living rooms and on front porches, parents and grandparents kept the memories alive. They showed their children the newspaper clippings they had saved, the photographs of the marches, the telegram announcing the new law. "I was there," they would say, pride mixing with pain in their voices. "We did this together." These family stories became part of a larger American story. The movement had changed more than just laws, it had changed people. Those who had been strangers during the march stayed in touch, writing letters and making long-distance calls. Northern college students who had come to help now sent their own children south to learn the history firsthand. The bonds formed during those tense days proved lasting. Local churches, once the headquarters of protest, became museums of memory. Display cases held artifacts from the movement, handwritten protest signs, worn-out shoes from the march, photographs of key moments. Each item told part of the story, helping new generations understand what their elders had accomplished. Time moved forward, but the lessons remained. When new challenges to voting rights emerged, people remembered Selma. The story of the bridge, the marches, and the triumph that followed became a blueprint for peaceful protest and determined resistance. Young activists studied what happened there, learning from those who had gone before. In schools across America, students now learned about Selma alongside other great moments in American history. But in Selma itself, it wasn't just history, it was personal. The clerk at the grocery store had been there. The man who delivered mail had marched. The woman who led church choir had sung freedom songs on the road to Montgomery. The past walked alongside the present every day. 50 years after the marches, people still gathered at the bridge each year to remember. They came from all over old marches with their grandchildren, students learning their history, people fighting new battles for justice. They walked across together, remembering those who had marched before them, celebrating what had been won, and recommitting themselves to the work that remained.